So let's go on and talk a little bit more about therapeutic factors. So there's been a movement to try to understand these therapeutic factors and how they may be best kind of communicated from the kind of science and research kind of more into clinician. What can the clinician hold on to in some way? So I'm going to cover two recent kind of topographies, taxonomies, nosologies, whatever language you want to use here, of the types of groups and the types of therapeutic factors that you may focus on in these groups. So this comes out mainly out of the work of Dennis Kivlighan, who kind of saw there being four types of groups. So the first type of group would be the classic psychoanalytic, psychodynamic group. And the therapeutic factors that would be focused from Yalom's list would be catharsis, interpersonal learning, insight, self-understanding. That in some way people are bringing their emotion, leading with their emotions. Emotion is the topic of exploration in the group, and we are exploring and potentially deconstructing and potentially changing aspects of our feeling life, aspects of our affective personality in some way. This thinking of attachment styles, object representations, self-representations. So affective insight groups. The second type of group he talked about was kind of the affective support group. So here again, the idea is to bring one's feelings to the group. People may do a lot of catharsis in these groups. There may be the installation of hope. There may be universality. But instead of kind of interpretation to change people's personalities, just these more simple experience of sharing one's feelings, getting that reflected back, is enough to create change or is appropriate for that setting. I'm thinking recently we had floods in Boulder County, and I was able to lead a group of people who were doing groups with people who were impacted negatively towards the group. So this is kind of a debriefing type of group. So we really pushed from the research on this kind of affective sharing, catharsis, loss, sadness, grief, eventually maybe working more into acceptance and hope, this connected of universality. So this was very much affective-oriented groups, but really focused on support and not the challenge or changing someone's affective process or thinking process in some way. So these were the two types of kind of affective, emotionally oriented group Kivlighan thought that you can almost fit every group that has this affective focus into, either pulling for insight or support. Now he did the same thing in thinking about cognitive groups or cognitive behavioral groups. So there's the cognitive insight group. So you're looking at people's thinking, the results of their thinking, their kind of potentially distorted projections about their future that their thinking comes out of, that in some way there's more challenge, feedback, you're working towards self-understanding, but more self-understanding and insight around cognitive and behavioral processes. When I don't get enough sleep, I am more likely to relapse, for instance. Or when I do not get enough food, I'm more likely to be grouchy in, say, affect regulation type of group. And then there's kind of cognitive support groups, just like there was affective support groups. So here these idea of kind of vicarious learning and guidance are kind of viewed as the most important in what the group will do. I think the classic example here is maybe 12-step support groups. So you'll hear people talk about what they did, solutions they have to their problems. There will not be crosstalk or feedback, but people will learn and grow about their own thinking process, their own behavioral process by hearing other people. So in some way, I think you can look at groups along this model. I can see it somewhat developmentally, particularly groups starting initially as more support, potentially with both affective and cognitive elements, and then eventually moving towards insight, where both affective and cognitive elements can happen. So I want to talk a little bit about the work of therapeutic factors inventories. So there was a few of these created. I think Rebecca McNair Siemens created quite a few. Worked a lot with George Tosca, Tony Joyce, and they would run these through kind of various factor analytic processes to see if Yalom's factors could be kind of further crystallized, so it's easier for the group leader to kind of focus on these aspects of group. So they kind of, through their creating survey instruments, created kind of 4 primary therapeutic factors. So what I'll do here is I'll talk about their factors and maybe give an example of a question they did, and then talk about the next one. So social learning. So this is learning about who you are in group, very much rooted in group as a microcosm of the world. So a question they would have is, my group is kind of a little piece of the larger world I live in. I see the same patterns and work them out in group, which helps me work them out in my outside life. That in some way in group, a focus and a therapeutic factor is engaging in our relationship and getting feedback about our relationships. So the second factor they outlined is secure emotional expression. I see this as, is there a way that people can bring all themselves, all feelings to their groups? A question they had is, although we have differences, this group feels secure to me. So is there a way that tension can be moderated, there can be diversity, but also inclusion? And I'm thinking you're working here with people's attachment issues, people's object representations, kind of self-representations, that in some way everything is welcome to be in group, and the group leader has the skill to welcome all feelings and help people moderate and tolerate people not liking each other, people being attracted to each other. So this would be the second main therapeutic factor, creating a space for secure emotional expression. The third one they outlined was installation of hope. That although we'll talk about grief, our histories, trauma, that in some way, for groups to be effective, there has to be this idea of present moment, forward moment, moving forward, not getting lost in depression, not getting lost in hopelessness. I also see this as related somewhat to positive psychology of gratitude, living a good life, moving forward. How can one, it's kind of transpersonal in that way, beyond just pathology. And then the last aspect I think is related to social learning, but it's awareness of relational feedback, awareness of relational impact. A question they would have here is, I've learned a lot about my impact on other people. So this is making a center of group process. How are people experiencing one another? Putting this into words, I would say, in a non-attacking manner, so people can kind of more accurately see how they are in relationship. In some way, this is the mirror that people so deeply crave by becoming part of a group, particularly people who may not have had enough mirroring in their early lives. And then also what's been shown as maybe not the most therapeutic, but the most appreciated aspect from the client view is getting mirrored and getting feedback about themselves in group. So George Tosca went a little further and tried to put this into one global factor deeply in the tradition of Western science. We can think about this in terms of Hartel's global definition of transpersonal psychology, which I'm sure you're aware of. But he conceptualized this global therapeutic factor in group as feeling hopeful about the processes of emotional expression and relational awareness, which then translate and promote into social learning. So I think it's a nice idea. I think kind of drawing on this reductionistic movement in group psychotherapy, the next major idea that was kind of happening simultaneously, which has been deeply adopted, particularly by research, empirically oriented group psychotherapists, I think comes out of Jennifer Johnson, although it was kind of updated by Krugel and other people. But these kind of three-factor model of what makes group effective, which has been shockingly accurate, that when you focus on these three factors, measure these, people get better really across demographics, diagnosis, social class, race. That these seem to be three kind of huge factors. I've already explained of my suspicion or about these kind of over-reductionist models. But these were the three factors that are outlined here in this model. The first is the positive bonding relationship. So this kind of can combine ideas of cohesion, group members engaging with each other, an emotional bond, having feelings between members. They would try to measure this, that people felt bonded, connected with one another. Often in their research, it was really focused on more of the positive affects between people, of acceptance, even like to some degree of friendliness. But I think it can be kind of beyond this, of just feeling somewhat connected. So the second factor outlined here is a positive working relationship factor. Now this kind of goes back into structure to some degree, but I have shared agreement with the tasks and goals of group. A question they might ask is, as group members, we agree on what we're working on here in group. So this can be very simple if you're in a CBT group, say a mindfulness-based CBT group working on depression or anxiety, that it's highly structured and that members are generally learning skills, practicing skills, monitoring their symptomology and kind of looking for changes, and that during the group, this is the focus, this is how time is spent within that group. The positive working relationship factor. And now these were kind of the two things that were needed. And something I deeply appreciate about this model, which I think is an ongoing wave, that the ripples have just begun in the field of group psychotherapy, but more about these destructive anti-therapeutic things and how to work with them and the importance of them. So they labeled this the negative relationship factor. So this is kind of looking at avoidance, empathetic failures in group, unresolved conflict in group, kind of boundary violations in group, someone walking out, someone touching someone else when they weren't asked to be touched, someone not following the rules of the group of sharing the talking time. So from their research, and I have deep appreciation for this, if a group leader can focus on the positive bonding relationships, engagement, connection, cohesion. Also focus on kind of the positive working relationships. What's the work of the group? Are people doing the work in the group? Are they engaging in moving forward? This would be very, very helpful. Then if they can somehow manage kind of the negative relational factors of avoidance, empathetic failures, that your groups will be successful in some way. So there's more models about how to break up Yalom's factors, or to kind of further reduce therapeutic factors. I probably said my reductionistic model of how to lead groups, which would be 1, you help members talk. 2, you help members talk to each other. And sometimes this is developmental. Sometimes group members are most comfortable talking to the leader initially, but over time you help them talk to each other. And then the third factor would be you help them talk about new things and say new things to one another. That in some way work is getting done if we're not caught in a repetition of the same thing over and over. So let's stop there, and I'll come back and talk more about therapeutic factors though.